Your encounter with these words right now is no coincidence from a quantum perspective, because consciousness always attracts information, experience, and questions that correspond to its own frequency. What you call reality is not a fixed, unchanging, and independent structure outside of you, as you were taught from childhood. Rather, it is like a living field constantly interacting with your state of consciousness, changing shape as it is observed. One of the most fundamental but unsettling findings of quantum physics states that reality is incomplete without an observer. That is, you are not merely someone watching what is happening. The moment you look, the moment you notice, even the moment you consider a possibility, you are actively participating in the formation of that reality. At this point, an unsettling door opens for most people. Because if this is true, the source of the recurring cycles in your life, the same kinds of relationships, similar disappointments, or the same oscillations of hope and collapse may not be the external world, but the patterns of perception you carry in your consciousness. This idea is unsettling because it brings back responsibility. But it is also liberating because it whispers that you haven't completely lost control. Once you truly begin to understand quantum reality, you'll realize over time that you don't see the world as it is, but observe it as you believe it to be. And this observation unconsciously produces a frequency signature. Consciousness acts like an invisible transmitter. This frequency, composed of past experiences, repressed emotions, learned fears, and subconsciously ingrained expectations, constantly sends a signal to the quantum field. The field, in turn, reflects back experiences that speak the same language. That's why some people seem lucky, while others constantly hit the same wall, because it's not fate, it's resonance. At this point, reality ceases to be an external necessity and becomes a relationship. It changes as you change. This awareness is beyond mere mental knowledge. It's a moment of inner awakening, because once you see this, you can no longer explain any experience solely by external factors. You realize that everything that happens to you isn't your fault, but rather connected to you. And this realization emerges not to drown you in guilt, but to enable you to make conscious choices. Understanding that reality shapes itself with you, not against you, is like crossing a threshold that is both frightening and profoundly calming, because there is no longer anywhere to escape, but at the same time a space has opened up where you can truly exist for the first time. That's why it's important to ask this question: how much of what you perceive as reality is real? And how much is merely a reflection you hold in your consciousness? Perhaps you have accepted what you call reality only as it was presented to you. You were content with what your five senses perceived, and the thought that there could be something beyond that either tired or frightened you. However, from a quantum perspective, the senses only gather data from a very narrow band. The real story is written in the consciousness behind the perception. The mind constantly completes what it thinks it sees, fills in the gaps with past experiences, and presents you with a logical world. But this logic is often the logic of old fears and learned limitations. That's why the same event creates completely different realities in two different people. Because at the quantum level, there is no single reality. There are as many realities as there are observers. Your world is a mirror of your level of consciousness, and this mirror silently reveals itself to you every moment. At this point, awareness ceases to be a process of acquiring knowledge and transforms into a confrontation. Because if what you perceive as reality is so intertwined with consciousness, the phrase, "life did this to me," begins to lose its power. It is replaced by a much deeper and more transformative question: in what state of consciousness did I observe this experience? This question is not accusatory. Rather, it is an awakening. Because it takes you from being a passive observer and makes you a conscious part of the cosmic game. Beginning to understand quantum reality doesn't mean life will magically become easier. But you're no longer being blindly swept along. And sometimes, the most comforting thing isn't that everything goes smoothly, but realizing why you're experiencing what's happening. Have you ever deeply considered why certain scenes in your life keep recurring, albeit in different costumes, with the same emotion? Different people, different times, different circumstances, but the same emotion. but a familiar disappointment, the same inner turmoil, or a similar wave of hope and collapse. From a quantum perspective, this isn't coincidence. It's an observer cycle. The mind doesn't just remember past experiences, it actively reproduces them. The subconscious chooses what it finds safe because it's familiar, even if that familiarity is painful. That's why people often unconsciously play the same record over and over again. This record consists of childhood beliefs, repressed emotions, unfinished stories, and internalized identity patterns like, "I've always been like this." The quantum field doesn't question this record. It only listens and responds. Reality responds to you at the frequency you're looking from. Therefore, the observer cycle begins not in the external world, but in the depths of consciousness. People often think life brings them back to the same point, but often they return there because they're looking at the same point with the same state of consciousness. When this goes unnoticed, time creates a sense of repetition, not progress. Years pass, but the feeling of being stuck in the same scene internally weighs heavily. This is where the unsettling aspect of quantum reality emerges. If the observer does not change, neither does the observed. The mind goes on autopilot and reconstructs the reality it knows. This is why some people constantly experience the same kinds of relationships, face the same economic hardships, or wake up with the same inner weariness. The problem is not the difficulty of external conditions. The problem is that the consciousness perceiving those conditions is never updated. Breaking the observer cycle is possible not by denying the past, but by removing it from being an automatic point of reference. Because consciousness does not have to remember the past. It does not have to relive it. At the quantum level, a new field of possibility opens up every moment. But if the old record continues to play, no new melodies are heard. This awareness initially makes one uneasy, because the narrative of victimhood begins to silently unravel. There is no longer a single external figure to blame, but at the same time, for the first time, a real field of choice emerges. Seeing the observer cycle is not for judging oneself, but for liberation, because consciousness, once it recognizes the cycle, no longer gets lost within it. And once this awareness emerges, playing the same record becomes a conscious choice. It is precisely at this point that change ceases to be a possibility and becomes a decision. Most people don't realize they are living in this cycle because the mind labels the repetitions as normal life. The same thoughts silently filling the mind every morning, the same anxieties arising for different reasons, similar fears returning only with a changed name are considered normal. However, from a quantum perspective, this situation is related to the inability of consciousness to update itself. The mind dislikes the unknown. It clings to what it believes it can control. Therefore, it finds the familiar even safer than freedom. The observer cycle takes root right here. You no longer observe reality, but an old interpretation of reality, and every new experience is used to confirm this old interpretation. Thus, consciousness becomes a closed system that convinces itself. The most striking aspect of this closed system is that the person thinks they are trying to change. Books are read, videos are watched, intentions are set, but as long as the point of observation remains the same, the result will also remain the same. Because change begins not with adding content, but with changing perspective. In quantum reality, the essential breaking point is when the question, "Why does this always happen to me?" is replaced by, "In what state of consciousness am I observing this?" This question is quiet, not dramatic, but extremely powerful. The observer cycle begins to crack with this question. Because when consciousness begins to observe itself, it is no longer automatic. And nothing that is not automatic can remain the same forever. The quantum field is filled with countless possibilities existing simultaneously, far beyond the cause and effect logic the human mind is accustomed to. None of these possibilities are initially good or bad. Their meaning is derived from the frequency of the consciousness that observes them. Therefore, every possibility that appears in your life is not a random option presented to you from the outside, but a door that resonates with your inner state. Most people think they are making a choice, but often consciousness automatically repeats responses learned in the past. And this repetition is mistaken for free will. From a quantum perspective, however, choice occurs before the action. Consciousness aligns with a possibility long before it transforms into an experience. The quantum field shows you what you believe you are ready for. This is why two people encounter the same opportunity, but only one sees it. For the other, that possibility silently closes like an invisible door. The field of infinite possibilities is always present, but the perception filter of consciousness narrows or widens this field. When the mind operates with fear, options decrease. When awareness increases, possibilities increase. This isn't about the universe being more generous to you. It's about you becoming more capable of perceiving more. The choices of consciousness often go unnoticed because they aren't experienced like a dramatic moment. They are silent, almost invisible. Whether to take a thought seriously or not, whether to hold on to a feeling or not, whether to label a possibility as not for me. These small internal movements are like contracts made with the quantum field. Humans often think they live in a limited reality, but it's not the field that's limited. It's the capacity for observation. The concept of the higher self gains meaning precisely here, because the higher self is a state of consciousness that can hold more possibilities simultaneously. At that level, timelines aren't rigid, identities aren't fixed, and the phrase, "it's always been this way," loses its power. As consciousness expands, choices become lighter. Life ceases to be a heavy struggle and becomes a process of adjustment. Perhaps the most liberating aspect of quantum reality is this: you don't create possibilities, you invite them, and what you invite is determined not so much by what you believe, but by the state of consciousness you are in. When this is realized, making a choice becomes a natural flow, not a necessity, because when consciousness becomes clear, the right possibility reveals itself effortlessly. People often think they aren't making a choice because the options seem already limited. However, this limitation is a result of the perception band of consciousness, not the external world. While countless possibilities vibrate at the quantum level every moment, consciousness only perceives those that match its own frequency as real. That's why some possibilities feel like they never come to you, because you are in a state of consciousness that excludes them. This exclusion is not a conscious rejection, but rather a silent blindness. A person cannot perceive a possibility for which they are not ready, and they think that what they cannot perceive does not exist. At this point, choice ceases to be a visible action and becomes a matter of the limits of perception. As consciousness expands, the options that life offers you also begin to multiply. But this multiplication is not an external abundance, but an internal opening. When this opening occurs, the perception of time also begins to change. The future is no longer a distant goal, but feels like a natural extension of the current state of consciousness. One stops saying one day because one realizes that in the quantum realm, everything already exists. The only thing missing is a state of consciousness aligned with that possibility. This awareness doesn't rush. On the contrary, it calms, because you no longer try to force things to happen. Choice becomes a moment of recognition, not a struggle. When consciousness senses which possibility aligns with you, decision-making becomes easier, and it is at this point that one realizes life isn't dragging them anywhere, but rather silently offering an invitation at every moment. Therefore, in quantum reality, the real transformation begins not with the question, "What do I want?" but with the question, "What state of consciousness am I in?" Because desires often arise from lack, and states of consciousness from lack. When one looks from the perspective of lack, the field of infinite possibilities seems threatening. Multiplicity creates chaos, uncertainty produces anxiety, but when awareness rises, the same field feels like a supportive and regulating structure. When consciousness stops trying to control possibilities, it begins to intuitively distinguish them. This is the quietest, but most powerful form of choice, because now the decision arises not from the noise of the mind, but from inner clarity. And when this clarity is achieved, the quantum field doesn't rush to respond. It's already there. It's simply the first time one truly begins to see. People often look for change in their lives in external circumstances. They expect a better time, more favorable conditions, the right people. or clearer opportunities. However, in quantum reality, change never begins externally. Everything happens in frequency. Frequency is less about what you think and more about the sum of your current state of consciousness. Your suppressed emotions, expectations, accustomed inner voice, and invisible relationship with yourself determine this vibration. Reality reacts instantly to this frequency, but this reaction often manifests as small shifts rather than dramatic transformations. People gradually withdraw from your life. Some doors silently close, new possibilities become apparent, or things that were previously difficult begin to flow strangely. At this point, most people are mistaken and call it luck or coincidence, whereas what is happening is the natural response of the quantum field to an updated signal. When the frequency changes, reality doesn't test you, it mirrors you. If you have internally shifted to a calmer, clearer, and less reactive state of consciousness, experiences with the same tone will begin to appear in the external world. This process is sometimes unsettling because everything belonging to your old frequency creates a feeling of disharmony. Relationships you once endured become burdensome. The chaos you were accustomed to becomes tiresome, and dramatic ups and downs lose their meaning. This is not regression, but readjustment. In quantum reality, the field does not resist your change, it only aligns. There is a common misconception that life will instantly become perfect when one raises their frequency, whereas a more accurate statement is, life becomes more honest. Everything that is disharmonious becomes visible, not hidden. Therefore, a frequency shift first brings clarity. You no longer feel what you don't want, but what you are not in harmony with. This feeling is not a mental decision, it is bodily and intuitive. The quantum field reads your intention not from words, but from consistency. As the distance between what you think and what you feel, between what you say and what you live, decreases, reality begins to respond more quickly. However, this speed is not a rushed race, but a frictionless flow. Forcing decreases, effort gives way to adjustment. At this point, one realizes for the first time, life is not against them. It has simply remained faithful to the signals it has sent so far. When the frequency changes, reality doesn't reward you. It takes you seriously. And perhaps this is the most striking aspect of the quantum perspective. The universe greets you not as you are, but as the state of consciousness in which you vibrate. When this is understood, change ceases to be a goal and becomes a natural outcome. The most surprising thing in this process is that reality doesn't tell you what you should do. The quantum field doesn't give instructions, doesn't exert pressure, doesn't direct. It only responds to your inner state. That's why a person experiencing a frequency shift often encounters questions from those around them like, "Why aren't you the same as before?" Because when you change, the roles others have imposed on you also lose their validity. At this point, reality acts like a silent editor. It weeds out the excesses, makes the inconsistencies visible. Sometimes people mistake this for a loss, but more often than not, it is a simplification. As frequency increases, life doesn't become more complicated. On the contrary, it becomes less complex but clearer, and this clarity, while initially creating a feeling of emptiness, is actually a space opening up for new possibilities. This feeling of emptiness is very valuable at the quantum level because when the noise of the old frequency subsides, consciousness finally begins to hear its own signal. Humans want to rush, to immediately fill the void with new things. But in quantum reality, the most powerful moments are hidden in the awareness of waiting. The field doesn't observe whether you will revert to old patterns, but senses whether you can remain in your new state of consciousness. To the extent that you can maintain your frequency, reality offers you new forms of harmony. That's why transformation deepens, not with grand steps, but with consistency. And at some point, a person realizes reality is no longer reacting to them. It is vibrating with them. When this harmonious vibration occurs, life ceases to be a process of struggling forward and transforms into a self-sustaining flow. The most subtle yet crucial point for a person to realize at this stage is this: frequency change is not an event. It is a state of being. It's not a transformation that happens once and for all, but a state of consciousness that is constantly being reselected. When a person reverts to their old reactions, reality reminds them of their old responses. But this is not a punishment, it's feedback. The quantum field doesn't hold grudges, doesn't store the past. It only reads the current vibration. Therefore, true change becomes visible not in momentary surges, but in small, consistent changes in daily life. Meta-observation is a silent threshold where, instead of being immersed in the experiences one lives, one begins to notice the consciousness experiencing those experiences. Once this threshold is crossed, life appears the same, but no longer feels the same. Because here, consciousness ceases to identify with thoughts and begins to observe them. When an emotion arises, instead of trying to suppress or justify it, an awareness emerges that can say, "I have an emotion right now." This seemingly small separation creates a major rupture in quantum reality, because now, what is observed is not only external events, internal reactions also enter the field of observation. At this point, one realizes, thoughts come spontaneously. Emotions arise spontaneously. But none of these are the same as consciousness. Meta-observation is the separation of consciousness from content. When this separation occurs, automatic reactions begin to dissolve. The same event happens, but the same person does not appear. A sentence that used to trigger you is now just a sound. A fear that used to draw you in is now like a wave observed from afar. This is not emotionlessness, but rather a deeper state of contact, because consciousness no longer has to defend itself. At the quantum level, this state is the purification of the observer effect. The observer no longer lets their own inner noise interfere with the measuring device. Therefore, reality begins to give clearer answers. In meta-observation, the perception of time also softens. Haste, regret, and constantly moving back and forth in the mind lose their power. The person feels more emptiness in the moment. This emptiness is not a deficiency, it is potential, because automatic identities do not work in emptiness. The phrase, "I am like this," is replaced by the awareness of, "I feel like this right now." This awareness does not erase the personality, but it does not solidify it either. Consciousness no longer fixes itself to a single narrative. This is why meta-observation is liberating. The person still thinks, feels, and makes decisions, but none of these have to define them. The relationship established with the quantum field also changes at this point. The field no longer encounters a defensive consciousness, but an observing and permissive awareness. In this awareness, intentions are simpler, choices are lighter, and reactions are more transient. The person does not try to correct themselves. They see themselves, and often, this seeing is far more transformative than correction. In the state of meta-observation, consciousness does not get lost in life. Life begins to flow through consciousness. At this point, the need for control diminishes because there is no longer chaos to control. There are only experiences that are observed, understood, and passed on. And for the first time, one deeply feels, "I am not what I experience, but the field that perceives it." This feeling is not a belief, but a direct experience, and once experienced, it cannot be undone. When one enters this state of consciousness, one is astonished to realize how mechanically the mind actually works. The emergence of the same thoughts at similar times, the triggering of the same emotions under the same conditions, no longer seems like a personal destiny, but like an observable process. Meta-observation creates a distance here. This distance is not cold, but compassionate. Because consciousness no longer blames itself, it only sees. And seeing is the simplest form of resolution. At the quantum level, this distance eliminates measurement error. When the observer does not include their own fears in the measurement, reality is read more clearly. At this point, one realizes that most suffering arises not from events themselves, but from the identification they form with those events. As meta-observation deepens, the perception of identity also begins to become more flexible. Humans find it increasingly difficult to define themselves through a single role, a single story, or a single past. The phrase, "This is who I am," is replaced by, "This is how I am experiencing this right now." This shift may initially create a feeling of emptiness, because the mind prefers to remain fixed. However, this emptiness is not the dissolution of identity, but its expansion. Consciousness no longer confines itself to a narrow framework. Alignment with the quantum field increases precisely at this point, because the field resonates more easily with consciousness in flux, not with fixed identities. At this stage, humans intuitively understand that change is not a threat, but a natural state. As this awareness takes root, the dramatic ups and downs of life also change meaning. What happens still happens. Difficulties don't completely disappear, but the consciousness experiencing them is no longer fragmented. In meta-observation, humans move through experiences but do not cling to them. This non-clinging is not indifference. Rather, it is a deeper form of connection, because consciousness is no longer on the defensive. When there is no defense, the quantum field also encounters no resistance. When you truly grasp quantum reality, you realize it doesn't create a loud revolution in your life. The real change is silent, and this silence is irreversible. Not being able to think as before isn't about not remembering old thoughts. It's about no longer being able to take them seriously, even if the same fears come to mind, even if the same sentences echo inwardly. Consciousness no longer clings to them, because once consciousness has seen the observer cycle, sensed that probabilities are chosen by consciousness, witnessed how frequency rearranges reality, and experienced a realm beyond thought through meta-observation, it no longer fits into old patterns. At this point, one doesn't say life has improved. Rather, one feels this: life can no longer deceive. Dramatic narratives lose their power, victim stories lose their internal persuasive ability, and excessive expectations give way to simple clarity. This is precisely the silent result. From the outside, everything looks similar, but internally, the world begins to be perceived from a different place. One no longer mistakes every thought for me, no longer accepts every emotion as absolute truth. This separation doesn't silence the mind, but it diminishes its impact. Over time, it becomes apparent that as the voice of the mind is silenced, intuition begins to speak more clearly. Decisions are made not hastily, but with a sense of inner harmony. The future ceases to be a scenario to be controlled. It becomes a consistent continuation with the present. This state is not indifference. On the contrary, it involves a deeper sense of responsibility, because now, a person cares not about what they are experiencing, but about how they are experiencing it. From a quantum perspective, this is the alignment of consciousness with its own timeline. The silent consequence of no longer being able to think as before is that a person can no longer become alienated from themselves. They recognize their inner contradictions, but do not fight them. They see inconsistencies, but do not dramatize them. There is still uncertainty in life, but this uncertainty is felt not as a threat, but as openness, because consciousness has now gained the capacity to remain with what it does not know, instead of fleeing from it. As this capacity expands, reality surprises less, because consciousness resists less. At some point, a person deeply understands this. Change was not about reaching a goal, but about connecting with what you already are. And when this connection is made, thoughts can no longer function as before, because they are no longer at the center. The center is silent. This silence is not emptiness, it is awareness. And awareness, once established, permanently transforms a person's relationship with life. With this silent transformation, a person realizes they can no longer be as preoccupied with the thoughts of others. The search for validation weakens, the need to be understood softens. Because consciousness is no longer defined by external judgments, a person intuitively understands that the perspectives of others also originate from their own frequencies. This understanding creates a distance, but this distance is not a disconnection, but clarity. Not every word is taken in. Not every idea is internalized. At the quantum level, this is the clarification of the boundaries of the field of consciousness. A person doesn't try to protect themselves, because there is no longer a self-perception to protect. There is only a field of awareness, and this field is in a natural balance against external influences. Over time, this balance brings a softer but firmer stance towards life. A person doesn't rush, because the feeling that nothing is to be missed has taken root. Decisions are shaped not by dramatic ruptures, but by inner harmony. Perhaps the deepest gift of quantum reality emerges here. A person no longer constantly forces things to be. What should be appears spontaneously at the appropriate frequency. Of course, there are problems to be solved, but consciousness doesn't get lost in them. It observes them, understands them, and acts when necessary. But at no stage does it identify itself with the problem. From a quantum perspective, this is consciousness's ability to remain centered. Questions that once preoccupied the mind fall silent, replaced by a simpler attention. People no longer constantly search for the meaning of life, because they intuitively feel that every moment carries meaning within itself. And this feeling cannot be explained by thought. It can only be experienced. This experience is the final and deepest result of no longer being able to think as before. Consciousness no longer tries to solve life. It learns to flow with it. If this resonates with you, you can subscribe to our channel to stay on this frequency. Also, writing, "I am observing my reality with consciousness," in the comments will be a silent but powerful way to clarify this awareness for yourself.